I thought I understood what family loyalty meant until December 20th, when my sister Emma sent me a text that shattered everything I believed about the people I loved most. Christmas is canceled this year. Dad lost his job 3 months ago and we're barely scraping by. We can't afford presents or even a decent dinner. Maybe just immediate family only. My heart sank as I read those words in my empty Portland apartment, the one I'd moved into after my divorce from Jake. I'd been supporting my family financially for years, while struggling myself working double shifts as a nurse practitioner, just to keep everyone afloat. Without hesitation, I texted back my understanding and immediately canceled my expensive gift orders, planning to spend Christmas alone with grocery store leftovers, believing my family truly needed my sacrifice more than I needed their company. The weight of Emma's message settled over me like a thick blanket as I sat in my sparse living room, surrounded by the remnants of a life I was still rebuilding. 6 months had passed since my divorce from Jake became final. 6 months since I'd packed everything I owned into my Honda Civic and driven 11 hours to Portland for what I hoped would be a fresh start. The apartment I'd found was nothing special, a one-bedroom unit in a converted Victorian house with thin walls and creaky floors, but it was mine, and after years of walking on eggshells around Jake's controlling demands, that freedom felt precious. What made Emma's news so devastating wasn't just the disappointment of missing Christmas with my family. It was the crushing realization of how much I'd already sacrificed to help them through what I believed was a temporary rough patch. Every month for the past 2 years, I'd been sending Dad $800 to help with what he called emergency expenses. Just last month, I'd scraped together an additional $3,000 for what he claimed were urgent medical bills for Mom's heart condition. The money had come from my emergency fund, the small nest egg I'd been building to eventually buy a house and start over properly. Working as a nurse practitioner at Portland General Hospital meant decent pay, but after rent, student loans, and my monthly contributions to my family, I was living paycheck to paycheck. My dinner tonight would be leftover ramen noodles from yesterday, the same meal I'd eaten 4 times this week. The expensive Christmas gifts I'd ordered for everyone, gifts I'd put on my credit card because I wanted to show my love even when money was tight, were now canceled. The refund wouldn't process for 3 to 5 business days, leaving me with an even tighter budget until after the new year. I picked up my phone to call Emma back, then hesitated. Her text had been brief and final, not an opening for conversation. The phrase, "immediate family only," stung particularly deep. What did that make me? I was their daughter, their sister, but somehow my physical distance had made me feel like an outsider looking in. I'd moved to Portland partly to escape the suffocating dynamics of my hometown, but now I wondered if I'd also move myself out of the inner circle of people who mattered. The apartment felt especially quiet as evening approached. My upstairs neighbor was playing Christmas music, the cheerful melodies filtering down through the ceiling and mixing with the distant sounds of traffic on Interstate 5. I found myself calculating how much money I'd sent home over the past 2 years and feeling sick at the total. Nearly $40,000 money that could have furnished my apartment properly or paid down my student loans significantly. Instead, I was sitting on a second-hand couch I'd bought from a garage sale, eating discount groceries and planning to spend Christmas Day watching Netflix alone. But family came first. That's what I'd been taught growing up, what Mom had drilled into me during those long conversations about responsibility and loyalty. Dad had worked construction for 30 years, supporting all of us through high school and college, never complaining about the overtime hours or the physical toll on his body. Mom had sacrificed her own career dreams to raise Emma and me, creating a warm home filled with love and laughter. When they needed help now, how could I even think about my own comfort? I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account, staring at the pathetically small balance. I'd planned to send another $500 for Christmas groceries, money I'd set aside from working an extra shift last weekend. The transfer was already set up scheduled to go through tomorrow morning. After reading Emma's text, though, I canceled it. If they were truly struggling as badly as she described, an extra 500 wouldn't make enough difference to justify my own financial strain. The decision felt both responsible and heartless. I closed the laptop and walked to my tiny kitchen where I'd already wrapped the few gifts I decided to keep for myself. A new book, some nice tea, a cozy throw blanket that was currently the nicest thing I owned. They looked lonely sitting on the counter, a sad reminder of how different this Christmas would be from the ones I'd grown up with, when our house was filled with extended family laughter and the smell of Mom's famous sugar cookies. My phone buzzed with a text from my coworker Jennifer. "Want to join us for Christmas dinner? Mark's making his famous prime rib, and you shouldn't be alone." The invitation was kind, and I almost accepted before remembering that Jennifer's family gatherings were always elaborate affairs with expensive wine and gifts that probably cost more than I made in a week. I politely declined, claiming I had other plans, then immediately felt guilty for lying. The truth was, being alone felt appropriate somehow. My family was struggling, making sacrifices, probably canceling their own traditions to make ends meet. It seemed selfish to celebrate when they couldn't. I would spend Christmas quietly, gratefully thinking about the people I loved and hoping that next year would be better for all of us. It never occurred to me to question Emma's story or to wonder why, if things were truly so dire, she hadn't asked for help directly. I trusted my family completely, and that trust was about to cost me everything. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of cold gray drizzle that makes Portland famous, the type of weather that seeps into your bones and settles there like a persistent ache. I woke up in my empty apartment to the sound of my neighbors next door loading their car for what sounded like a family road trip. Through my thin bedroom wall, I could hear their excitement as they discussed who was bringing what dish and whether they'd remembered to pack all the presents. Their joy felt like salt in an open wound. I'd taken the day off work, thinking I'd spend it cooking something special for myself, or maybe finally hanging the few pictures I'd been meaning to put up since moving in. Instead, I found myself moving through the apartment like a ghost, straightening things that were already straight and reorganizing drawers that didn't need organizing. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the occasional sound of cars passing by on the wet street below. Around noon, I heated up a frozen dinner, one of those sad single-serving meals that come in black plastic containers and taste like cardboard mixed with salt. The package claimed it was home-style turkey with stuffing and cranberry sauce, but it bore no resemblance to any home-style meal I'd ever eaten. I sat at my tiny kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten every meal for the past 6 months, and tried to pretend this was just another day. The hardest part was seeing Christmas everywhere I looked. My neighbors across the street had strung lights around their entire house, creating a warm glow that spilled across the sidewalk. Every car that passed seemed to be filled with wrapped packages and smiling families heading somewhere important. Even the grocery store I'd visited yesterday had been buzzing with people buying last-minute ingredients for elaborate holiday meals. I felt like I was watching Christmas happen to everyone else while I remained on the outside looking in through windows I couldn't reach. I deliberately avoided social media, knowing it would be filled with happy family photos and Christmas morning preparations that would only make me feel worse. My phone sat silent on the coffee table, and I was grateful for the lack of distractions. The last thing I needed was to see other people's joy when I was struggling to maintain my own emotional equilibrium. Around 6 in the evening, I decided to take a hot bath, one of the few luxuries my apartment offered. The old clawfoot tub was original to the building and deep enough to actually relax in. I'd splurged on some nice bath salts the previous week, telling myself I deserved one small indulgence. As I soaked in the warm water, I tried to focus on the positives in my life. I had a good job that I genuinely loved despite the stress and long hours. My health was good. I was finally free from Jake's constant criticism and control, and I was building something that belonged entirely to me. But gratitude felt forced when my heart was heavy with loneliness and worry about my family's situation. I kept thinking about Dad, wondering how he was handling the stress of unemployment after so many years of steady work. Construction had been his identity as much as his career, and I knew losing his job must have been devastating to his sense of self-worth. Mom was probably trying to hold everyone together while dealing with her own health problems, the heart condition that required expensive medication and regular doctor visits. After my bath, I put on my most comfortable pajamas and settled onto the couch with a cup of tea and a book I'd been meaning to read. But concentrating proved impossible. Every few minutes, my mind would wander to Christmas memories from my childhood when our house had been the center of extended family celebrations. Aunts and uncles, cousins, grandparents all crowded into Mom's living room, talking and laughing while football games played on television in the background. The kitchen would be filled with different dishes, each person contributing something special to the feast. Those Christmases had felt magical, not because of the gifts or the food, but because of the sense of belonging they created. Everyone had a role to play. Everyone was important. Everyone was included. Now I was 28 years old, spending Christmas Eve alone in an apartment that still felt temporary, eating frozen dinners and trying not to feel sorry for myself. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed, and my heart jumped with hope that maybe someone from my family was thinking of me. But it was just a spam email about post-holiday sales, one of dozens I'd been receiving as retailers tried to squeeze every last dollar out of the season. I deleted it without opening it and tried to return to my book. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was probably the only person in my family with a steady income right now, yet I was also the only one spending Christmas alone. But that's what sacrifice looked like sometimes. That's what love looked like when it couldn't be expressed through presents, when distance and circumstances made physical togetherness impossible. I was giving my family the gift of not having to worry about me, not having to stretch their resources even thinner to include me in their scaled-down celebration. At 10:30, I gave up pretending to read and decided to go to bed early. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and I planned to spend it quietly, maybe taking a long walk in the park if the rain stopped, definitely calling my family to wish them well and let them know I was thinking of them. As I brushed my teeth, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and was surprised by how tired I looked. The stress of the past few months was showing in the dark circles under my eyes and the way my shoulders seemed permanently hunched forward. I was just about to turn off the lights when my phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. When I picked it up, the screen was showing my Instagram feed, even though I hadn't meant to open the app. Emma's profile picture appeared in the suggestions, and before I could think better of it, I found myself looking at her page. The most recent post was from earlier today, a photo of what looked like an elaborate Christmas tree in the background, though Emma wasn't in the shot. The caption was just a simple "getting ready," with Christmas tree and heart emojis. My stomach twisted with confusion. The photo showed the corner of a beautifully decorated tree with expensive-looking ornaments and what appeared to be professionally wrapped gifts underneath. It didn't match the story of a family too broke for a proper Christmas celebration, but maybe it was an old photo, something from last year that she'd reposted for nostalgia. Or maybe she was house-sitting for someone wealthy, helping them prepare for their own celebration. I quickly closed the app and put my phone on the nightstand face down so I wouldn't be tempted to look again. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Emma wouldn't lie about something so important, especially not when she knew how much I'd been sacrificing to help the family financially. I was probably overthinking things, letting loneliness and stress make me paranoid about innocent social media posts. Tomorrow was Christmas, and I needed to focus on gratitude instead of suspicion. But as I lay in the dark, listening to the rain against my windows and the distant sounds of a city settling down for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about that photo didn't fit the narrative I'd been given. The tree had looked too perfect, too expensive, too much, like the elaborate decorations from our childhood Christmases that Emma had described as impossible this year. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that stress and isolation were making me see problems where none existed. Sleep was a long time coming. I woke up at 11:27 on Christmas morning to the sound of church bells ringing somewhere in the distance, their melody carrying across the wet Portland air like a reminder of all the traditions I wasn't participating in. My first thought was to call my family and wish them a Merry Christmas, but something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of that Instagram photo from yesterday, or maybe it was just the hollow feeling of waking up alone on what should have been the most togetherness-focused day of the year. Instead of reaching for my phone immediately, I made coffee and stood at my kitchen window watching the few people who were out walking their dogs or jogging despite the persistent drizzle. Christmas Day in Portland felt subdued, almost respectful, as if the city itself was acknowledging that this was a day for families to be together privately. My reflection in the window looked ghostly against the gray backdrop, and I realized I was still wearing the same pajamas I'd put on yesterday evening. The coffee was bitter, probably, because I'd been using the same cheap grocery store brand for months, but it was warm and caffeinated, which was all I really needed. I settled onto my couch with the mug cradled in both hands and finally allowed myself to think about what my family might be doing right now. Were they gathered around their kitchen table trying to make the best of a difficult situation? Was Dad putting on a brave face while Mom worried about money and Emma tried to keep everyone's spirits up? The guilt of not being there to help even in small ways felt heavy in my chest. I could have driven down yesterday, could have contributed something to their modest celebration, even if money was tight for everyone. But Emma's text had been so clear about keeping things small, so definitive about the family's financial situation, that I'd assumed my presence would only add stress to an already difficult day. Around 11:45, my restlessness got the better of me, and I found myself opening Instagram without really meaning to. I told myself I was just checking to see if any of my Portland friends had posted Christmas morning photos, maybe getting some vicarious joy from their celebrations. The app opened to my main feed, and the first thing I saw was a notification that Emma had started a live video just 3 minutes earlier. My finger hovered over the notification for a long moment. Part of me wanted to see how my family was coping, wanted to feel connected to them, even from 300 miles away. But another part of me was afraid of what I might see, afraid of confirmation that their Christmas was as sad and limited as Emma had described. Finally, curiosity won out, and I tapped on the live video link. The title of the stream read, "Christmas Eve Magic," and my heart immediately started pounding. Christmas Eve. But it was Christmas morning now, which meant this was from last night while I'd been lying in bed feeling guilty about not being there to support them. The video quality was too good for someone who was supposedly struggling financially, and as the camera panned across the scene, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. I was looking at our family's living room, but not the scaled-down modest Christmas I'd been expecting. Instead, Emma was showcasing what could only be described as a holiday extravaganza. The camera moved slowly across a 12-foot Christmas tree that reached almost to the ceiling, decorated with what had to be thousands of lights and ornaments that caught the camera's flash like tiny jewels. The tree was so large and elaborate that it must have cost several $100s, not counting the decorations. But the tree was just the beginning. As Emma continued her live tour, chattering excitedly about our annual Christmas Eve celebration, I saw a professional catering setup along one wall with silver chafing dishes and uniformed servers arranging what looked like an expensive buffet. There was a chocolate fountain and ice sculpture in the shape of a swan and bottles of champagne chilling in crystal buckets that I recognized as Mom's good crystal, the set she'd inherited from her mother and only brought out for the most special occasions. My hands started shaking as the camera panned to show the crowd of people filling our family home. This wasn't the immediate family-only gathering Emma had described. I counted at least 30 people, maybe more, including extended family members, family friends, and faces I didn't recognize, but who were clearly enjoying themselves immensely. Everyone was dressed up, the women in cocktail dresses and the men in dress shirts and ties, as if this were a formal holiday party rather than a family struggling to make ends meet. The live comments were flowing past on the screen, friends and family members praising the gorgeous setup and asking about the amazing decorations. Someone wrote, "This party gets better every year." Another comment read, "Your family knows how to celebrate." Emma was reading the comments aloud and laughing, thanking people for their compliments and promising to post more photos later. As the camera continued its tour, I caught sight of my cousin Derek showing off a brand new Apple Watch to someone off camera, the kind that cost at least $400. My Aunt Patricia was wearing diamond earrings I'd never seen before, and she was describing them to another woman as my Christmas gift to myself. The casual extravagance was staggering, especially when I remembered the $3,000 I'd sent just last month for Mom's supposed medical emergency. Then, the camera found Dad, and my world completely collapsed. He was standing near the makeshift bar holding a glass of what looked like expensive scotch and deep in animated conversation with our neighbor, Mr. Rodriguez. Dad looked healthy, happy, and absolutely nothing like someone who'd lost his job 3 months ago and was struggling to keep his family afloat. He was wearing a new sweater I'd never seen, and when he laughed at something, Mr. Rodriguez said his face was lit up with genuine joy, not the stressed worry I'd been imagining. But it was Mom who delivered the final blow. She appeared in the frame, wearing a beautiful red dress and the pearl necklace Dad had given her for their 20th anniversary, looking radiant and festive as she chatted with a group of women near the fireplace. When someone mentioned her heart problems, she laughed and said something I couldn't quite hear, but her body language was that of someone in perfect health. She was animated, energetic, and showing no signs whatsoever of the serious cardiac issues that had supposedly required thousands of dollars in medical treatment. The comments kept flowing. Best party of the year. Your family always throws the most amazing celebrations. Can't wait for New Year's Eve at your place. Emma was eating up the attention, describing the menu and thanking their hired DJ for the perfect playlist. A hired DJ. For a family that was supposedly too broke to afford Christmas presents. I sat frozen on my couch, watching my family celebrate an elaborate party that had to have cost thousands of dollars, while I ate leftover ramen and worried about their financial well-being. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme that for a moment, I wondered if I was hallucinating, if stress and isolation had finally caused some kind of mental breakdown. But the video was real, the timestamp was current, and every detail I was seeing contradicted everything Emma had told me about their situation. The worst part wasn't just the lie itself, though. That was devastating enough. It was the realization that this party was happening without me, that my family was celebrating exactly the kind of elaborate Christmas we'd always had, but they deliberately excluded me from it. The text about being too broke wasn't about scaling down their celebration. It was about making sure I didn't expect to be included. As Emma wrapped up the live video, promising to post more content later and wishing her viewers a magical Christmas, I finally understood the truth. My family hadn't included me in their Christmas plans, not because they couldn't afford to celebrate, but because they didn't want me there. They'd lied about their financial situation to keep me away while they enjoyed the kind of lavish party my monthly contributions had probably helped fund. I closed the app with trembling fingers and sat in the absolute silence of my apartment, trying to process what I'd just seen. Everything I'd believed about my family's situation was false. Every sacrifice I'd made, every dollar I'd sent, every lonely evening I'd spent worrying about their well-being, all of it based on elaborate deception. They weren't struggling, they were thriving, and they were doing it with my money while deliberately keeping me isolated and alone. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, sharp and deep and impossible to ignore. But underneath the hurt was something else, something that felt like a seed of anger beginning to sprout. I'd been played, manipulated, used like a personal bank account by the people I loved most in the world, and tomorrow I was going to find out just how deep this deception really went. Sleep was impossible after what I discovered, so I spent the rest of Christmas Day doing something I should have done months ago, investigating my own family. I made a fresh pot of coffee, settled at my kitchen table with my laptop, and began systematically going through every piece of communication, every bank transaction, and every social media post I could access. What I found made me physically sick to my stomach. The pattern was so obvious once I started looking for it that I felt like an idiot for missing it before. Every single emergency that had required my financial help coincided perfectly with family events I hadn't been told about. The $3,000 for Mom's heart condition had been requested on October 15th. When I checked Emma's Instagram from that time period, I found photos from our cousin Michelle's engagement party on October 20th, a lavish affair at an expensive downtown restaurant with professional photography and what looked like designer decorations. The monthly $800 payments I'd been sending for emergency expenses had started in February, right after Emma's own engagement party that I'd learned about through a mutual friend who'd posted photos. I'd never received an invitation, never even been told it was happening. When I'd asked Emma about it later, she'd claimed it was just something small and last minute, and apologized for not thinking to include me since I lived so far away. Going back through her social media posts from the past year was like reading a detailed record of a lifestyle that was completely incompatible with the financial struggles she'd described. There were photos from expensive restaurants, weekend trips to wine country, shopping excursions to boutiques I couldn't afford to look at, and regular girls' nights at upscale bars in downtown Sacramento. The captions were always casual, never mentioning money or cost, but the visual evidence was overwhelming. One post from September showed Emma at a spa day with Mom and Aunt Patricia, all of them getting facials and massages at a resort I recognize as one of the most expensive in the area. The caption read, "Sometimes you just need to treat yourself," with a spa emoji and several heart eye faces. The treatments they were getting would have cost at least $300 per person, maybe more. I'd sent $500 that same week because Dad had texted about needing help with utility bills. The most damning evidence came when I started calculating the actual timeline of Dad's supposed job loss. According to Emma, he had been unemployed for 3 months, which would put the loss of his job sometime in late September. But I found a Facebook post from Dad himself in early October celebrating the completion of a major construction project with his crew. The post included photos of him in his work gear, clearly employed and happy about a successful job completion. I cross-referenced this with local news coverage and found an article about the same project Dad had posted about a new community center that had been completed ahead of schedule and under budget. The article specifically mentioned the construction company Dad worked for and praised their efficient work. There was even a quote from Dad himself identified as a senior foreman talking about his pride in the project and his company's commitment to quality work. But the real smoking gun came when I found a group chat screenshot that Emma had accidentally posted as part of an Instagram story sometime in August. The screenshot showed only the top portion of a conversation, but the visible messages were enough to make my blood boil. One message from someone whose name was cut off read, "We should probably keep Maria busy with work stuff so she doesn't expect invitations to family events." Another message, this one clearly from mom, said, "She's been so stressed about money lately, maybe it's better if we don't add to her pressure." The screenshot had been posted for less than 10 minutes before Emma deleted it, probably realizing her mistake, but I'd saved it automatically to my phone's memory. Looking at it now, months later, I could see it for what it really was: evidence that my family had been deliberately excluding me from their gatherings, while using my financial stress as justification for their deception. I spent the next several hours going through my bank statements, adding up every transfer, every Venmo payment, every emergency contribution I'd made over the past 2 years. The total was staggering $38,427, nearly $40,000 that I'd sent to a family I believed was struggling while I lived on ramen noodles and worked overtime shifts to make ends meet. That money could have changed my entire situation. I could have bought a car that didn't require monthly repair visits. I could have furnished my apartment properly instead of sitting on secondhand furniture and eating off paper plates because I couldn't afford a proper dish set. I could have paid down my student loans significantly, maybe even taken a vacation for the first time since my divorce. Instead, I'd been funding my family's elaborate lifestyle while they excluded me from the very events my money was helping to pay for. The cruelest irony was that I'd been supporting their social life while having none of my own. The isolation I'd felt, the loneliness that had become my constant companion, had been partially self-imposed because I genuinely believed my family needed my money more than I needed entertainment or social activities. I'd turned down invitations from coworkers, skipped social events, and generally lived like a monk because every extra dollar I had was going to people I thought were in crisis. But they weren't in crisis. They were living better than I was, hosting elaborate parties, taking spa days, and maintaining the kind of comfortable lifestyle I'd grown up with, but could no longer afford because I was paying for theirs. They'd turned me into their personal charity fund while treating me like an outsider who didn't deserve inclusion in their actual lives. As dawn broke on December 26th, I sat surrounded by printouts of bank statements, screenshots of social media posts, and pages of notes documenting the elaborate deception my family had been maintaining. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. They'd been lying to me for months, possibly years, about their financial situation while using my love and concern for them as a weapon to extract money they didn't actually need. The hurt was beyond anything I'd ever experienced, deeper than my divorce from Jake, more devastating than any professional setback or personal disappointment. This wasn't just betrayal by people I loved, it was systematic, calculated manipulation designed to exploit my strongest values and deepest loyalties. They'd weaponized my family bond against me, turning my desire to help into a tool for their own financial benefit. But as the sun came up and I stared at the mountain of evidence spread across my kitchen table, hurt began transforming into something else. Anger was building in my chest, clean and righteous and absolutely justified. They thought I was naive enough to keep sending money indefinitely without ever questioning their stories. They thought I was too isolated and too trusting to figure out what they were doing. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. At exactly 7:48 a.m. on December 26th, as I sat surrounded by the damning evidence of my family's deception, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. The timing felt almost supernatural, as if the universe had decided to deliver the final piece of proof I needed to confirm everything I discovered during my sleepless night of investigation. The message was from Dad, and reading it felt like being slapped across the face by someone I'd trusted completely. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." It began using the same affectionate tone he'd always used when he wanted something from me. I know money's tight for everyone right now, but we've got a serious situation here. The landlord is threatening eviction if we don't get caught up on rent immediately. Could you help us out with $3,800? It would literally save Christmas for the whole family. I hate to ask, especially after everything you've already done for us, but we're really desperate here. I stared at the message for a full minute, reading it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. Less than 8 hours earlier, I'd watched my father laughing and drinking expensive scotch at an elaborate party that had probably cost more than most people spend on their entire Christmas celebration. I'd seen him healthy, happy, and clearly not worried about money in the slightest. And now he was asking me for $3,800 to prevent an eviction that almost certainly wasn't real. The amount he was requesting was particularly insulting. $3,800 was more than my monthly salary after taxes, money I couldn't spare even if I believed his story. But more than that, it was clearly calculated to seem urgent and specific, the kind of precise figure that would make his request seem legitimate rather than arbitrary. He wasn't asking for some help with rent or whatever you can spare. He was demanding a specific amount that would require me to drain my savings account completely. I opened my laptop and pulled up Instagram again, going directly to the stories that were still live from the previous night's party. The contrast between what I was seeing and what Dad was claiming was so extreme, it would have been comical if it weren't so personally devastating. In one story, Mom was showing off the elaborate floral arrangements that must have cost hundreds of dollars. In another, Emma was giving a tour of the catered buffet that included lobster tail and prime rib. The most infuriating detail was a short video Emma had posted around midnight, showing Dad himself opening what was clearly an expensive bottle of champagne. The label on the bottle was visible for just a moment, and I recognized it as Dom Perignon, which retailed for over $200. My father was popping champagne that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month, and then 8 hours later, he was asking me for nearly $4,000 to avoid homelessness. I took screenshots of everything, building a complete record of their Christmas celebration, while Dad's text message sat unanswered on my phone. Each image felt like another piece of evidence in a case I was building against people I'd loved unconditionally my entire life. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could the same man who was laughing and celebrating in these videos be the desperate father begging for emergency rent money in my text messages? The answer was simple and horrible. He wasn't desperate at all. This rent crisis, like every other financial emergency over the past 2 years, was completely fabricated. They weren't struggling to keep their home. They were probably trying to recoup the money they'd spent on their lavish party. My monthly contributions weren't keeping them afloat during hard times. They were subsidizing a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford, while keeping me isolated from the benefits of my own generosity. I thought back to every conversation I'd had with Dad about money over the past year. Every worried phone call where he'd described their mounting bills and financial stress. He'd been so convincing, so detailed in his explanations of where the money was going and why they needed help. He'd even sent me copies of what he claimed were medical bills for Mom's heart treatment documents that I now realized must have been fabricated or doctored to support his story. The manipulation went beyond just asking for money. Dad had been carefully crafting a narrative designed to make me feel guilty for having financial stability while they struggled. He'd emphasized how proud he was that I'd become successful, how glad he was that I didn't have to worry about money the way they did. He'd made me feel selfish for spending money on myself while they were in crisis, creating a psychological framework where any personal purchase felt like stealing food from my family's table. But they weren't in crisis. They were living exactly the same comfortable middle-class lifestyle they'd always maintained, funded partly by their own income and partly by my contributions. The only person actually struggling financially was me, the person working overtime shifts and eating discount groceries so I could support a family that was secretly living better than I was. My phone buzzed again with another text from Dad. I know it's a lot to ask, sweetheart, but we're really scared here. The landlord has been understanding up until now, but he says this is our final warning. We could lose everything if we don't get this handled today. You're the only person we can turn to. The follow-up message was expertly crafted to increase urgency and guilt, painting me as their only salvation, while emphasizing the supposedly dire consequences of my refusal to help. I opened my banking app and looked at my account balance, $4,100 and change. If I sent the money Dad was requesting, I'd be left with barely enough to cover my own rent next month, let alone food utilities or any other expenses. He was asking me to risk my own financial stability to solve a problem that didn't exist, to rescue a family that was already living more comfortably than I was. The realization that hit me then was perhaps the most painful of all. They knew exactly what they were doing to me. This wasn't thoughtless exploitation or casual manipulation. They had deliberately calculated how much money they could extract from me without completely destroying my ability to keep sending more. They knew I was struggling, knew I was sacrificing my own comfort to help them, and they decided my financial well-being was less important than their social lifestyle. I started typing a response several times, crafting measured explanations about my own financial situation and my inability to help with such a large amount. But each draft felt inadequate, missing the fundamental point of what had been done to me. This wasn't about my inability to afford the money they were requesting. This was about the systematic deception they'd used to steal nearly $40,000 from someone they claimed to love. They'd lied about Dad's employment status. They'd fabricated Mom's medical emergency. They'd created fictional financial crises while hosting elaborate parties. They'd excluded me from family gatherings while using my money to fund those same gatherings. And now, Dad was asking for more money with the same manipulative techniques that had worked so effectively for the past 2 years. But those techniques weren't going to work anymore because I finally understood who my family really was. They weren't the struggling, loving people I'd been supporting out of loyalty and compassion. They were con artists who had identified me as an easy mark and had been systematically exploiting my love for them while giving me nothing in return except lies and isolation. I deleted all my draft responses and typed something much simpler, something that captured exactly how I felt about their betrayal and their continued attempts to manipulate me. My hands were steady as I wrote the words that would change everything between us forever. Lose my number. I don't fund liars. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then immediately blocked Dad's phone number. But I wasn't finished. They'd made this situation into something much bigger than just asking for money. They'd made it into a question of whether I was going to continue enabling their deception or finally stand up for myself. I was choosing to stand up. The moment I sent that text message to Dad, something fundamental shifted inside me. The hurt and betrayal that had been consuming me since Christmas Eve crystallized into something much more powerful, righteous anger combined with absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. My family had spent 2 years treating me like a personal ATM machine while excluding me from their lives, and I was done being their victim. Blocking Dad's number was just the beginning. I opened my contacts list and began systematically removing every family member who had participated in this deception. Emma's number was next, followed by Mom's. Then I moved on to the extended family members I'd seen celebrating at their party: Aunt Patricia, Uncle Richard, Cousin Derek, and a dozen others who had been enjoying the fruits of my financial contributions while pretending I didn't exist. Each blocked number felt like cutting a rope that had been dragging me underwater. These people had been weighing me down emotionally and financially for months, and with each deleted contact, I felt lighter. I wasn't just protecting myself from their future manipulation, I was reclaiming my right to decide how my money was spent and who deserved my generosity. But blocking phone numbers wasn't enough. They'd been orchestrating this deception across multiple platforms using social media to maintain their facade while keeping me isolated from the truth. I logged into Instagram and began blocking every family member I could find. Emma's account was first followed by Mom's Facebook profile, Dad's rarely used social media accounts, and every cousin, aunt, and uncle who appeared in their networks. The process was methodical and strangely therapeutic. Each block was a small act of self-protection, a boundary I was establishing to prevent further manipulation. I wasn't just cutting off communication, I was cutting off their ability to monitor my activities, to gauge my emotional state, or to craft new strategies for extracting money from me. For the first time in months, my social media would actually be mine. Next came the financial accounts, and this was where the real power lay. I logged into my online banking and immediately canceled all recurring transfers to family members. The monthly $800 payment to Dad was eliminated with a few clicks. The emergency fund I'd established specifically for family crises was closed entirely. Every automatic payment, every standing authorization, every financial connection between my accounts and theirs was severed permanently. But I didn't stop there. I changed all my banking passwords, updated my security questions, and removed Dad as an authorized contact on all my accounts. He'd been listed as someone who could inquire about my account status in case of emergency, a precaution I'd established when I first moved to Portland in case something happened to me. Now I realized he'd probably been using that access to monitor my financial situation, timing his requests based on when he knew I'd received paychecks or tax refunds. I called the fraud department at my bank and explained that I needed to flag any future attempts to access my accounts by specific individuals. The customer service representative was professional and understanding, helping me establish additional security protocols that would prevent anyone from social engineering their way into my financial information. They offered to issue me new account numbers entirely, which I accepted without hesitation. My next call was to Venmo, where I'd been sending smaller emergency payments when bank transfers were too slow. I explained that my account had been compromised by family members and requested that all previous authorization be revoked. The representative helped me change my username, update my privacy settings, and establish a new account that couldn't be discovered by people who had previously had access. PayPal required similar treatment along with Zelle and every other payment platform I'd ever used to send money to family members. Each conversation with customer service felt like documenting a crime, explaining how people who should have been trustworthy had violated that trust systematically. The representatives were always sympathetic, probably because financial manipulation by family members was more common than anyone wanted to admit. As I worked through the digital cleanup, my phone began buzzing with notifications from blocked numbers trying to reach me through various apps and platforms. Someone was attempting to contact me through Facebook Messenger, Instagram, direct messages, even LinkedIn. The desperation was immediate and obvious. They'd realized what I was doing and were scrambling to reestablish contact before I could complete the process of cutting them off. I ignored every attempt at communication and continued working through my security protocols. I updated my address with all financial institutions, making sure any physical mail would come only to my Portland apartment rather than potentially being intercepted by family members who still had access to my childhood home. I established new security codes and changed my backup phone number to a Google Voice number they wouldn't recognize. The thoroughness of my response was intentional. This wasn't a temporary emotional reaction that I might reverse once I calmed down. This was a permanent restructuring of my relationship with people who had proven they couldn't be trusted with access to my resources or my emotional well-being. They'd had multiple opportunities to be honest with me, multiple chances to include me in their lives without deception, and they'd chosen manipulation instead. By noon, I had successfully isolated myself from every financial and communication channel my family had been using to access me. My bank accounts were secure, my social media was clean, and my phone was finally quiet. The silence felt profound after months of constant requests for money manufactured emergencies and emotional manipulation disguised as family loyalty. But even as I completed the technical aspects of cutting them off, I knew this was just the beginning of the fallout. They'd been counting on my monthly contributions to maintain their lifestyle, and I just eliminated that income stream permanently. The $3,800 Dad had requested wasn't just about rent, it was probably meant to cover expenses from their elaborate Christmas party. Without my financial support, they were going to have to face the real-world consequences of their spending habits for the first time in years. I felt a moment of uncertainty about the younger family members who might be caught in the crossfire of this decision. My cousin Tyler was only 16 and probably had no idea what the adults in his family had been doing. Emma's daughter Madison was 12 and completely innocent of her parents' financial manipulation. But I reminded myself that protecting them from the consequences of their parents' choices wasn't my responsibility. I wasn't their parent, and I wasn't obligated to fund their lifestyle indefinitely just because some family members were innocent bystanders. The final step in my financial independence was the most satisfying. I opened a new savings account specifically for myself, one that would rebuild the emergency fund I'd depleted, trying to help people who didn't need my help. Every dollar I'd previously sent to family members would now go into this account building toward goals that would actually benefit me: a reliable car, a properly furnished apartment, maybe even a down payment on a house someday. As I completed the paperwork for my new account, my phone buzzed with yet another blocked number trying to reach me. The frequency of attempts was accelerating, which meant they were starting to panic about losing their primary funding source. Good. Let them experience the same financial stress I'd been living with for months, while I sacrificed my own comfort to support their lies. I turned off my phone completely and spent the rest of the afternoon in silence, processing what I'd just done. I'd essentially orphaned myself, cutting ties with everyone who shared my blood and most of my childhood memories. It was the most drastic action I'd ever taken, but also the most necessary. They'd forced this choice on me by making it impossible to maintain a relationship with them while protecting my own well-being. The quiet of my apartment felt different now, not lonely, but peaceful. For the first time in months, I knew my phone wouldn't ring with another financial emergency, another guilt-inducing story designed to separate me from my paycheck. I was free to live my own life, spend my own money, and build relationships based on genuine connection rather than economic exploitation. They'd taught me an expensive lesson about the difference between family and people who share your DNA. Real family doesn't lie to you, manipulate you, or exclude you from their lives while taking your money. Real family earns trust through consistency and honesty, not through emotional blackmail and manufactured crises. I was ready to find out what real family looked like, even if I had to build it myself from scratch. By 8:15 that morning, my phone had accumulated 55 missed calls from various numbers I didn't recognize. Even with all the family numbers blocked, they were finding ways to try reaching me, borrowing phones from neighbors, calling from work numbers, probably standing in line at payphones if any still existed in Sacramento. The desperation was palpable, and it told me everything I needed to know about how much they'd been depending on my financial contributions. I turned my phone back on briefly to check my work schedule, and the sheer volume of blocked call notifications was staggering. My voicemail box was full, my text message notifications were disabled because of the volume of blocked attempts, and my email was starting to fill with messages from family members who'd apparently remembered they had my work email address. Each attempted contact was like a small confirmation that I'd made the right choice in cutting them off. Emma managed to break through the blocks by borrowing her fiancé Mark's phone, a number I hadn't thought to block, because he'd never been directly involved in the financial manipulation. When his name appeared on my caller ID around 8:30, I almost didn't answer, thinking it might be a work-related emergency since Mark was a paramedic and occasionally dealt with patients from our hospital system. Maria, thank God. Emma's voice came through the phone tight with panic and barely controlled hysteria. What the hell is wrong with you? Why are you blocking everyone? Dad is freaking out. Mom is crying and you're acting like we did something terrible to you. This is Christmas week for crying out loud. How could you choose now to have some kind of breakdown? The accusation that I was having a breakdown combined with the complete lack of acknowledgement of their deception crystallized my anger into something white-hot and precise. I watched your Christmas party, Emma. I said, my voice deadly calm. I saw the champagne, the catering, the hired DJ. I saw Dad popping Dom Perignon while he was texting me about rent money. So don't you dare try to gaslight me into thinking I'm the one with the problem here. There was a long pause, and I could almost hear Emma's mind racing as she tried to figure out how much I actually knew and what kind of story might still work to salvage the situation. That wasn't, you don't understand the whole picture, she finally said, her voice shifting from panic to the kind of careful tone people use when they're trying to manage someone they think might be unstable. Yes, we had some people over, but that doesn't mean we're not struggling. Mom's medical bills are real. Dad's job situation is complicated, and we're barely holding things together. I have screenshots, Emma, I interrupted. I have bank records showing every transfer I've sent you. I have social media posts from the past year showing spa days and shopping trips and expensive restaurants. I know about Michelle's engagement party that coincidentally happened right after Dad asked for $3,000 for Mom's heart condition. I know you've been lying to me for months, maybe years. The silence that followed was longer this time, and when Emma spoke again, her voice had changed completely. The panic was still there, but now it was mixed with something that sounded like genuine fear. Okay, maybe we haven't been completely upfront about everything, but you don't understand how complicated things are. Dad has been trying to protect everyone from the real situation. The money you've been sending, it's not going where you think it's going. That admission hung in the air between us like a confession. She just confirmed that my money hadn't been going toward the emergencies and necessities they'd claimed. Where has my money been going, Emma? I asked, though I was starting to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. He's been having some problems, gambling problems. The money you've been sending has been going to cover his debts to keep loan sharks away from the family. We thought if we could just get him through this rough patch, get him some help, we could fix everything without you ever having to know. The Christmas party was supposed to be one last normal family gathering before we dealt with everything. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not only had my family been lying about their financial situation and excluding me from their gatherings, but my money had been enabling a gambling addiction I'd known nothing about. Every dollar I'd sacrificed, every overtime shift I'd worked, every meal of ramen noodles I'd eaten, it had all been feeding Dad's addiction, while my family maintained their facade of normalcy. How much does he owe? I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. A lot, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. More than we can handle on our own. That's why the rent money was so important. It wasn't really for rent. It was to make a payment to some very dangerous people who've been threatening the family. When you blocked Dad and canceled all the transfers, we realized we don't have any way to make the payment that's due next week. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and cruelty. They'd been using my love and concern for my family's well-being to fund Dad's gambling addiction, putting everyone in danger while keeping me completely in the dark about what was really happening. And even now, Emma was trying to make me feel responsible for their safety, as if their current crisis was my fault for refusing to continue enabling behavior I'd never known existed. How long has this been going on? I asked. About 2 years, Emma admitted. It started small, just occasional trips to the local casino, but it got worse after you moved to Portland. I think Dad felt like he needed to replace the stress of worrying about you with something else, and gambling became his outlet. We only found out how bad it was a few months ago when the loan sharks first contacted us. 2 years. My entire time in Portland, every struggle I'd faced while rebuilding my life after my divorce had been made worse by the fact that I was unknowingly funding a gambling addiction. The monthly payments I'd been making weren't helping my family. Through temporary hard times, they were enabling destructive behavior that was putting everyone I loved at risk. And you decided the best solution was to lie to me about it, I said, my voice rising, despite my efforts to stay calm. Instead of telling me the truth and asking for help dealing with Dad's addiction, you created this elaborate fiction about job loss and medical bills and financial struggles. You excluded me from family gatherings, so I wouldn't see that you were living normally while I was sacrificing my own well-being to support what I thought was a crisis. Hewem. We were trying to protect you, Emma said, her voice defensive now. You'd just gone through a horrible divorce. You were starting over in a new city dealing with your own stress. We didn't want to burden you with Dad's problems on top of everything else you were dealing with. We thought we could handle it ourselves and you'd never have to know. The rationalization was as infuriating as the original deception. They'd decided I was too fragile to handle the truth about Dad's addiction, so they'd manipulated me into funding it without my knowledge or consent. They'd stolen my agency, my right to make informed decisions about how to help my family, and then justified it by claiming they were protecting me. You weren't protecting me, I said coldly. You were protecting yourselves. You were protecting your ability to maintain your lifestyle while using my money to clean up Dad's messes. You excluded me from family events because you didn't want me to see how you were really living, not because you were worried about my emotional well-being. That's not entirely true, Emma said, but her voice lacked conviction. Look, maybe we made some mistakes in how we handled this, but the bottom line is that Dad is in real danger now. Without the money you've been sending, we can't make the payments to keep the loan sharks away. These aren't the kind of people who accept late payments or negotiate payment plans. They've already threatened to hurt Mom if Dad doesn't pay up by January 3rd. And there it was, the final manipulation. After admitting to months of systematic deception, Emma was still trying to make me feel responsible for my family's safety. She was still trying to guilt me into sending money, still treating me like an ATM machine that could be activated with the right combination of fear and family loyalty. The tragedy was that if they'd been honest with me from the beginning, I probably would have helped. If Dad had come to me 2 years ago and admitted he had a gambling problem, if he'd asked for help getting treatment instead of money to cover his losses, I would have done everything in my power to support his recovery. If they'd included me in their family gatherings and been transparent about their struggles, we could have worked together to find real solutions. Instead, they'd chosen deception and manipulation, turning me into an unwitting enabler while excluding me from the very family I was sacrificing to support. They'd made their choices, and now they would have to live with the consequences of those choices without my money to cushion the fall. I'm sorry Dad has a gambling problem, I said finally. I'm sorry the family is in danger because of his addiction. But you forfeited any right to my help when you decided to lie to me about everything for 2 years. Figure out another solution because I'm done funding this disaster. I hung up the phone and blocked Mark's number too, then turned the phone off completely. I'd heard enough to understand the full scope of what had been done to me, and no amount of additional explanation or manipulation was going to change my decision to cut them off financially. They were on their own now, just like I'd been on my own for the past 6 months, while unknowingly funding the very problems that had torn our family apart. At 8:42 a.m., during one of the brief moments when I'd turned my phone back on to check for any work-related emergencies, a single voicemail managed to get through from Mom's cell phone. I'd blocked her number, but apparently she'd found a way to leave a message through some kind of system override or by calling from a slightly different number. The notification sat on my screen like a tiny bomb, and I stared at it for several minutes before finally deciding to listen. Mom's voice, when it came through my phone speaker, sounded broken in a way I'd never heard before. She'd always been the strong one in our family, the person who held everyone together during crises and maintained optimism even in difficult times. But the woman speaking in this voicemail sounded defeated, terrified, and completely overwhelmed by circumstances she couldn't control. "Maria, sweetheart, please call us back." She began, her voice shaky with barely suppressed tears. "I know how this all looks from your perspective, and I know you have every right to be angry with us. We've handled this whole situation terribly, and we've hurt you in ways we never intended. But please, before you write us off completely, let me explain what's really been happening here." There was a pause, and I could hear her take a shuddering breath before continuing. "Your father hasn't been honest with any of us about the extent of his gambling problem. Emma and I thought we knew what was going on, thought we were managing a difficult but contained situation. We only discovered yesterday during the Christmas party just how deep this goes and how dangerous it's become." The admission hit me like a physical blow. Even Emma's explanation had been incomplete. The family members I'd thought were part of an elaborate conspiracy to defraud me had actually been victims of Dad's deception too. They'd been manipulated just like I had, maybe even more extensively, since they'd been living with the daily stress of his addiction while I'd been protected by distance. "Oh, the money you've been sending," Mom continued, her voice becoming smaller and more frightened. "It's been going directly to pay gambling debts that your father hid from all of us. He told us the money was helping with general household expenses, helping us maintain stability while he looked for better work. We had no idea he was taking that money straight to loan sharks who've been threatening our family for months." I had to pause the voicemail and sit down. The scope of Dad's deception was staggering. He hadn't just been lying to me about needing financial help, he'd been lying to his own wife and daughter about what that help was funding. He'd created separate fictional narratives for different family members, keeping everyone isolated from the complete truth so no one could challenge his story or seek help for the real problem. "Yesterday during the party, some men showed up at our door." Mom's voice continued, and now she was openly crying. "They said your father owed them $67,000 money that was supposed to be paid by Christmas Day. They weren't polite about it, Maria. They made it very clear what would happen to our family if the debt isn't satisfied by January 3rd. They specifically mentioned Emma, and her daughter said it would be a shame if something happened to such pretty women." The threat was clear and terrifying. These weren't empty intimidation tactics. These were specific targeted threats against innocent family members who'd been caught up in Dad's addiction without their knowledge or consent. Madison was only 12 years old, a little girl who had nothing to do with her grandfather's gambling, but who was apparently being used as leverage to ensure payment of his debts. "We confronted your father after the men left," Mom continued. "That's when we learned the truth about everything. He's been gambling for over 2 years, losing money we didn't know we had, borrowing from dangerous people to chase his losses. The monthly payments you've been sending weren't keeping us afloat. They were barely covering the minimum payments on debts we didn't know existed." The betrayal was multi-layered and complex. Dad had betrayed me by lying about needing financial help, but he'd also betrayed his own wife and daughter by putting them in danger without their knowledge. He'd used my money to enable his addiction while letting Mom and Emma believe they were managing normal financial stress. Everyone in the family had been victims of his deception, just at different levels of awareness. "The Christmas party wasn't what you think it was," Mom said, her voice strengthening slightly as she tried to explain what I'd seen on Emma's live stream. "Your father insisted on having it said it was important to maintain normal family traditions. While we figured out solutions to our problems, we thought he meant the employment situation and some general financial stress. We didn't know he was using the party to distract us while he figured out how to ask you for more money to pay off loan sharks." The manipulation was breathtaking in its sophistication. Dad had orchestrated an elaborate Christmas celebration, specifically to create a smokescreen for his continued financial deception. He'd spent money the family couldn't afford on a party designed to maintain the illusion of normalcy, while he planned to extract thousands more dollars from me to cover debts his own wife didn't know existed. "I'm not calling to ask you to fix this for us," Mom said, though her voice suggested she was fighting every maternal instinct to do exactly that. "I know we've lost the right to ask for your help by letting this deception go on for so long. I'm calling because you're our daughter, and I need you to know that whatever happens to us isn't your fault. You've already given more than anyone should have to give, and you have every right to protect yourself from this disaster." The absolution she was offering felt both generous and heartbreaking. Even in her moment of crisis, even facing threats against her granddaughter and daughter, Mom was trying to protect me from feeling guilty about a situation I hadn't created and couldn't fix. She was essentially giving me permission to walk away, acknowledging that I'd already sacrificed more than enough for a family that had repaid my generosity with systematic deception. But if there's any part of you that can forgive us any possibility that you might be willing to help us figure out a solution that doesn't involve just giving your father more money to gamble away, please call us back. We're going to lose everything: the house, the cars, maybe our safety, but more than that, we're going to lose you. And losing you would be the worst consequence of all of this, worse than any financial ruin or physical danger. The voicemail ended with the sound of Mom crying softly, and I sat in my quiet apartment, feeling completely emotionally shattered. I'd been prepared for continued manipulation, for guilt trips and emotional blackmail designed to separate me from more of my money. Instead, I'd received what sounded like a genuine confession and apology, along with an acknowledgement that their situation was largely self-inflicted and that I bore no responsibility for fixing it. But underneath Mom's apparent honesty, I could hear the desperation of someone facing consequences she'd never imagined. Her family was genuinely in danger because of Dad's addiction, and while she wasn't explicitly asking me to save them, the subtext was clear. I was probably the only person in their lives with the financial resources to make this problem disappear quickly enough to prevent real harm to innocent people. The moral complexity of the situation was staggering. My family had deceived me, excluded me, and used my money to enable destructive behavior that had put everyone at risk. They deserved to face consequences for their choices, and I deserved to protect myself from further exploitation. But Madison was 12 years old, and Emma, despite her participation in the deception, was facing threats of violence because of her father's addiction. I saved the voicemail and sat staring at my phone for a long time, trying to figure out what the right thing to do actually was. I'd cut off my family's access to my money to protect myself from continued manipulation, but now I was facing a situation where that decision might have consequences for people who were more victims than perpetrators. The easy answer was to maintain my boundaries and let them figure out their own solution. Dad's addiction was his responsibility, and the consequences of his choices shouldn't automatically become my financial burden just because I happened to have the resources to help. I'd already given $40,000 to this family without knowing what I was actually funding, and I had every right to refuse to give more. But the complicated answer was that family loyalty might sometimes require helping people even when they've made terrible choices, especially when innocent people were caught in the crossfire. I could help without enabling, could set conditions that ensured any assistance actually solved problems rather than perpetuating them. The question was whether I was strong enough to help my family without losing myself in the process. While I was still processing Mom's devastating voicemail, my phone buzzed with a message from a username I didn't immediately recognize on the gaming app where I played occasional puzzle games to unwind after difficult shifts at the hospital. The message was from Tyler the Beast, and it took me a moment to realize this was my youngest cousin Tyler, who was only 16 and had always been the most innocent member of our extended family. Maria, are you okay? The message read. Everyone's going crazy trying to reach you, and Grandpa Thomas is acting really weird. Can we talk? I think there's stuff happening that the adults don't want me to know about, but I'm not stupid. I know something's really wrong. Tyler had always been perceptive beyond his years, probably because he'd grown up in a family that specialized in creating dramatic situations he was too young to fully understand. Unlike the other family members who'd been actively participating in the deception, Tyler had been genuinely excluded from the financial manipulation because of his age. If anyone could give me an honest perspective on what was really happening, it would be him. I replied that we could talk, and within minutes, my phone was ringing with a call from Tyler's number. When I answered, I could immediately hear that he was upset, his usually confident teenage voice shaky with confusion and fear. Maria, I'm so glad you picked up, he said. I don't know what's going on with the family, but everybody's freaking out and no one will tell me why. Mom and Dad are having these hushed conversations that stop when I walk into the room, and Aunt Sandra has been crying all morning. Even Emma looks scared, which never happens. What do you know about your grandfather's gambling? I asked, directly figuring that Tyler deserved honesty, even if the adults in his life had decided he couldn't handle the truth. There was a long pause before Tyler responded, and when he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. How do you know about that? The adults think it's this huge secret, but I've known about Grandpa's casino trips for months. He told everyone he was going to visit you at work on Tuesdays, but I followed him once because I thought it was weird that he never brought back any photos or stories about seeing you. The confirmation that Dad had been using me as cover for his gambling trips felt like another small betrayal, but I was more concerned about what Tyler might have witnessed. What did you see when you followed him? He went to the Thunder Valley Casino, Tyler said. I waited in the parking lot for like 3 hours, and when he came out, he looked terrible, like really upset and angry. I heard him on the phone with someone talking about needing more time to pay something back. I thought maybe he was having money problems and was too proud to tell the family, so I didn't say anything. Tyler's description painted a picture of Dad's addiction that was even more pathetic than I'd imagined. He wasn't just gambling occasionally or even winning. Sometimes he was clearly losing consistently and desperately trying to chase his losses with borrowed money. The phone conversation Tyler had overheard was probably with one of the loan sharks who were now threatening the family. Has he been going to the casino every week? I asked. Pretty much, Tyler confirmed. Every Tuesday for at least 6 months, maybe longer. And sometimes on weekends too, when he thinks no one's paying attention. Last month, I saw him leaving the house at like 10 p.m., which is weird because he usually goes to bed early. When I asked Aunt Sandra where he was going, she said he was running errands. But what kind of errands happen at 10 o'clock at night? The frequency and timing of Dad's gambling trips suggested his addiction was completely out of control. Evening casino visits indicated he was gambling compulsively, probably chasing daily losses with money he couldn't afford to lose. The fact that he was lying to his own wife about his nighttime whereabouts showed how deep his deception had become. Tyler, yesterday during the Christmas party, did you see any men come to the house? Men who didn't look like they belonged at a family gathering. Oh yeah, Tyler said, his voice becoming more animated as he remembered something significant. That was so weird. These 2 guys in suits showed up around 10 o'clock, and they definitely weren't there to celebrate Christmas. They asked to speak with Grandpa privately, and when they were talking to him, everyone else got really quiet. The music stopped, people stopped eating, and everyone was trying to pretend they weren't listening. Did you hear any of their conversation? Some of it, Tyler admitted. They weren't trying to be quiet, which was kind of scary. One of them said something about Grandpa owing them a lot of money and how they don't usually have to visit people's homes during family parties. The other guy made some comment about Emma's car and how pretty Madison is, which made Emma grab Madison and take her upstairs immediately. The threat had been even more explicit than Mom's voicemail had suggested. These men had deliberately made their intentions clear in front of the entire family, using the Christmas gathering as an opportunity to demonstrate how easily they could access everyone Dad cared about. The psychological intimidation was sophisticated and terrifying. "What happened after the men left?" I asked. "Everything changed," Tyler said. "Like completely. The party basically ended, even though people stayed for a while longer. Emma was crying. Aunt Sandra looked like she'd seen a ghost, and Grandpa disappeared into his office and didn't come back out. People started leaving early, making excuses about getting home before it got too late. By midnight, it was just immediate family, and everyone was having these intense, whispered conversations." Tyler's account confirmed that the loan shark's visit had shattered the family's ability to maintain their facade of normalcy. The elaborate Christmas celebration I'd seen on Emma's livestream had apparently deteriorated into a crisis management situation once the reality of Dad's gambling debts became undeniably present. "Did anyone mention my name during these conversations?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Oh, yeah, definitely," Tyler said. "I heard your name mentioned a lot, and people kept talking about money and transfers and whether someone should call you right away or wait until morning. Emma was saying something about how you might not understand the whole situation, and Grandpa kept insisting that you'd help if you knew how serious things were." Even in crisis, Dad had been planning how to manipulate me into solving his gambling problem. The $3,800 text message I'd received that morning hadn't been a spontaneous request for help. It had been a calculated strategy developed during the family's late-night crisis management session. They'd probably spent hours crafting the perfect approach to extract money from me without revealing the true nature of their emergency. "Tyler, are you safe right now?" I asked, realizing that a 16-year-old shouldn't be dealing with the stress of loan shark threats and family financial crises. "I think so," he said, but his voice was uncertain. "Mom and Dad took me to stay with my other grandmother last night. Said we needed to give Uncle Thomas and Aunt Sandra some space to work through their problems. But I can tell they're scared about something, and no one will give me straight answers about what's really happening." Tyler was being protected from the immediate danger, but he was also being kept in the dark about circumstances that directly affected his safety and his family's stability. As a youngest family member, he was bearing the emotional burden of a crisis he didn't fully understand, while being excluded from information that might help him cope with the situation. "Listen to me carefully," I said. "Your grandfather has a serious gambling addiction, and he owes money to dangerous people who have threatened to hurt family members if he doesn't pay his debts. The money I've been sending to help the family has been going to cover his gambling losses, not the emergency expenses everyone thought. That's why people are scared, and that's why your parents moved you somewhere safe." Tyler was quiet for a long time, processing information that probably connected a lot of confusing dots from recent months. "That's why you blocked everyone's phone numbers," he finally said. "You found out about the gambling and realized they'd been lying to you about needing financial help." "Exactly," I confirmed. "I'm not angry with you or Madison or anyone who didn't know what was really happening. But I can't keep sending money that's being used to enable your grandfather's addiction, especially when that money isn't actually solving the problem." So what happens now?" Tyler asked, and his voice sounded very young despite his mature understanding of the situation. "Are we just going to lose everything? Is someone going to hurt Emma and Madison?" The questions Tyler was asking were the same ones I'd been wrestling with since discovering the truth about my family situation. I could maintain my boundaries and let them figure out their own solution to Dad's gambling debts, but that might mean real harm came to innocent people. Or I could intervene in some way that protected the family while ensuring Dad faced consequences for his addiction. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but Tyler, whatever happens, this isn't your fault or your responsibility to fix. You're 16 years old, and you shouldn't have to worry about adult problems like gambling addiction and loan sharks. The adults in your life need to figure out solutions that don't put kids at risk. Will you help them? Tyler asked directly. I know they lied to you, and that's really messed up, but Emma and Madison don't deserve to get hurt because Grandpa made bad choices. The question crystallized the moral dilemma I'd been avoiding. Tyler was right. Emma and Madison didn't deserve to suffer violent consequences because of Dad's addiction, regardless of Emma's participation in the financial deception. But helping them would require me to risk my own financial security again, and there was no guarantee that any money I provided would actually solve the underlying problem, rather than just postponing the inevitable consequences. I'm thinking about it, I told Tyler honestly, but if I do help, it won't be the same as just sending money like I've been doing. It would have to be part of a real solution that addresses your grandfather's addiction and protects everyone's safety long term. That sounds fair, Tyler said. And Maria, thank you for explaining what's really happening. Everyone else thinks I'm too young to handle the truth, but not knowing was actually worse than knowing. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment thinking about Tyler's perspective on the family crisis. He was the only person who'd been completely honest with me, the only one who'd provided information without trying to manipulate my response. His insights had filled in crucial gaps in my understanding of Dad's addiction and the loan shark threats. But Tyler had also reminded me that this situation involved more than just the adults who'd participated in deceiving me. There were genuinely innocent people whose lives were at risk because of choices they hadn't made and problems they hadn't created. My decision about whether and how to help would affect not just my relationship with the family members who'd betrayed me, but also people like Tyler and Madison, who were victims of the same deception I'd experienced. The question was whether I could find a way to protect the innocent without enabling the guilty to help my family without sacrificing my own well-being in the process. After my conversation with Tyler, I spent the rest of the day researching loan sharks, gambling addiction treatment, and the legal implications of what my family was facing. What I discovered made the situation even more complex and frightening than I'd realized. The men who had visited during the Christmas party weren't just making empty threats. They were part of a network with a documented history of violence against families who couldn't pay gambling debts. A quick internet search revealed several news articles from the Sacramento area over the past 2 years documenting loan shark violence. One particularly disturbing case involved a construction worker who defaulted on gambling debts and ended up in the hospital with 2 broken arms and a shattered kneecap. Another case described a family whose house had been firebombed after the father failed to make payments on time. These weren't people who negotiated or accepted payment plans. They were criminals who used brutal intimidation to ensure compliance with their terms. The timeline Tyler had described suggested Dad had been involved with these people for months, possibly close to a year. The fact that they'd escalated to visiting our family home during a holiday gathering indicated they were reaching the end of their patience with his excuses and delays. The specific threats against Emma and Madison weren't just psychological pressure, they were promises of action that would be carried out if the debt wasn't satisfied by their deadline. I found myself caught between competing moral imperatives that seemed impossible to reconcile. On one hand, Dad's gambling addiction was his responsibility, and the consequences of his choices shouldn't automatically become my financial burden just because I had the resources to help. He'd deceived me for years, stolen nearly $40,000 through manipulation, and put innocent family members at risk through his selfish behavior. Justice demanded that he face the full consequences of his actions without being rescued by the sister he'd systematically exploited. On the other hand, Madison was 12 years old and had never done anything to deserve being threatened by violent criminals. Emma, despite her participation in the financial deception, was facing potential physical harm because her father had made choices she couldn't control. Even Mom, who'd apparently been kept in the dark about the true extent of Dad's gambling, was now facing the loss of her home and possibly her safety because she'd trusted her husband to be honest about their financial situation. The loan sharks didn't care about the family dynamics or who was innocent versus guilty in the deception. They only cared about recovering their money, and they were willing to hurt anyone connected to Dad to ensure payment. My decision about whether to help wouldn't just affect my relationship with family members who had betrayed me, it would determine whether innocent people suffered violence because of problems they hadn't created. I called the Sacramento Police Department's non-emergency line to ask about options for families facing loan shark threats. The officer I spoke with was sympathetic but realistic about the limitations of law enforcement in these situations. "We can take a report and increase patrols in the area," he explained, "but unless these guys actually commit a crime or we catch them in the act of making threats, there's not much we can do proactively. Loan shark operations are usually pretty sophisticated about staying just within the boundaries of what we can prosecute." "What about witness protection or some kind of temporary relocation assistance for the family members being threatened?" I asked. "For a gambling debt situation, probably not," the officer said. "Those resources are typically reserved for people who are witnesses in major criminal cases or victims of domestic violence with court orders. A family facing loan shark threats because of gambling debts would need to find their own temporary housing solutions." The conversation confirmed what I'd suspected. The legal system couldn't protect my family from the consequences of Dad's gambling debts. If I wanted to ensure their safety, I would need to either pay the debt myself or help them find alternative solutions that didn't rely on law enforcement intervention. I spent the evening researching gambling addiction treatment programs, debt consolidation services, and residential rehabilitation facilities that specialized in helping people with severe gambling problems. What I learned was both encouraging and sobering. Effective treatment for gambling addiction was available, but it required the addicted person to acknowledge their problem and commit to significant lifestyle changes. Programs typically lasted 60 to 90 days and cost $15,000 to $20,000, not including follow-up therapy and support services. More importantly, successful recovery required complete removal from gambling environments and total surrender of financial control to trusted family members or professional money managers. Dad would need to give up all credit cards, bank access, and financial decision-making power for at least 2 years, while he rebuilt healthy relationships with money and impulse control. The other crucial element was family therapy for everyone who'd been affected by the addiction. Mom Emma and even Tyler would need counseling to understand how they'd been manipulated and how to avoid enabling Dad's behavior in the future. The entire family system would need to be restructured around honesty and accountability rather than the secrecy and deception that had allowed Dad's gambling to escalate to dangerous levels. But all of these solutions required Dad to voluntarily admit his problem and accept treatment, something that many gambling addicts resist, even when facing serious consequences. The fact that he'd continued lying to his family about the extent of his debts, even after loan sharks had threatened them, suggested he might not be ready to face the reality of his situation. I found myself creating 2 different scenarios in my mind, trying to figure out which approach would be most likely to protect innocent family members while avoiding further enabling of Dad's addiction. Scenario 1 involved walking away, completely maintaining the boundaries I'd established, and letting the family face the consequences of Dad's choices without my intervention. This approach would protect my own financial security and avoid rewarding the deception I'd experienced. Dad would be forced to confront the reality of his gambling addiction without being rescued by money he hadn't earned. The family would lose their house and comfortable lifestyle, but they'd also be free from the cycle of debt and deception that had been controlling their lives. The problem with this scenario was Madison and Tyler, innocent children, who would suffer because of adult choices they couldn't control. Even if the loan sharks didn't follow through on their threats of violence, the family's financial collapse would disrupt these kids' education, housing stability, and emotional security during crucial developmental years. Scenario 2 involved strategic intervention designed to protect innocent family members while ensuring Dad faced consequences for his addiction. I could pay off the loan sharks directly to eliminate the immediate threat of violence, but only as part of a comprehensive plan that included mandatory treatment for Dad family therapy for everyone affected and complete restructuring of the family's financial arrangements to prevent future gambling. This approach would be expensive, probably $50,000 to $70,000 when treatment costs were added to the debt payment, but it might actually solve the underlying problem rather than just postponing it. Dad would get the help he needed. Innocent family members would be safe, and the family could rebuild their relationships based on honesty rather than deception. The risk with this scenario was that I might be enabling Dad's addiction by rescuing him from consequences, even if I attached conditions to my help. There was no guarantee he would comply with treatment requirements or maintain sobriety after completing a program. I could spend my entire savings account solving his current crisis, only to face the same situation again in 6 months when he relapsed and accumulated new debts. As I weighed these options, I kept coming back to Tyler's question about whether Emma and Madison deserved to suffer because of Dad's choices. The answer was clearly no. Children shouldn't face violence or homelessness because their grandfather was addicted to gambling. But protecting them would require me to risk my own financial security again, trusting a family that had already betrayed that trust systematically. The decision I was facing wasn't just about money or family loyalty, it was about what kind of person I wanted to be when innocent people needed help, even when that help came at significant personal cost. I could choose safety and self-protection, which were entirely justified given what my family had done to me. Or I could choose compassion and intervention, accepting the risk that my generosity might be exploited again in exchange for the possibility of actually solving the underlying problems. I fell asleep that night without reaching a decision, but with a growing sense that doing nothing wasn't really an option I could live with. The question wasn't whether to help, it was how to help in a way that protected everyone who deserved protection, while ensuring the people responsible for creating this crisis faced appropriate consequences for their choices. I woke up on December 27th with absolute clarity about what needed to happen. I couldn't save my family by simply throwing money at Dad's gambling debts, but I could protect innocent people while ensuring this crisis became a turning point rather than just another episode in a cycle of deception and enabling. The solution would be expensive and emotionally difficult, but it was the only approach that addressed the root causes instead of just the symptoms. My first call was to Tyler, whose honesty had helped me understand the true scope of the situation. "I'm going to help," I told him without preamble, "but it's going to happen on my terms with conditions that ensure this never happens again. Are you somewhere safe, where we can talk freely?" "Yeah, I'm at my other grandmother's house," Tyler said, and I could hear relief in his voice. "Mom and Dad are at work, so I can talk. What kind of conditions are you thinking about?" "Your grandfather is going to enter a residential gambling addiction treatment program immediately," I explained. "Not in a few weeks, or when it's convenient for him, but this week. He's going to surrender all financial control to a professional money management service, and he's going to attend therapy for at least 2 years. The whole family is going to participate in counseling to learn how to recognize and avoid enabling his addiction." Tyler was quiet for a moment, processing the scope of what I was proposing. "What if he refuses? Grandpa Thomas doesn't like being told what to do, and I don't think he's ever admitted that gambling is actually a problem for him." "Then I don't pay the loan sharks and the family deals with the consequences of his choices," I said firmly. "I'm not interested in rescuing someone who isn't committed to real change." If he wants my help, he has to prove he's serious about recovery by accepting conditions that will actually address his addiction. That sounds fair, Tyler said. What about everyone else I know? Emma and Aunt Sandra were part of lying to you about the money, but they didn't know about the gambling until yesterday. Tyler's question highlighted one of the most complex aspects of the situation. Emma and Mom had participated in deceiving me about the family's financial status, but they'd been victims of Dad's manipulation too. They deserved consequences for their role in the deception, but they also deserved protection from the violence Dad's addiction had brought into their lives. Everyone who was involved in lying to me is going to make amends through actions, not just apologies, I explained. Emma is going to get a job and contribute to household expenses instead of depending on family money. Your Aunt Sandra is going to attend therapy to understand how she enabled your grandfather's addiction without realizing it. Most importantly, everyone is going to participate in rebuilding our family relationships based on honesty instead of manipulation. What about the house and all their stuff? Are they going to lose everything anyway? The house will probably need to be sold, I admitted. Even after I pay off the loan sharks, the family can't afford the mortgage payments without my monthly contributions, and I'm not going back to funding their lifestyle, but I'll help them find appropriate housing that they can actually afford on their real income. The plan I was developing would completely restructure my family's living situation, forcing them to accept a more modest lifestyle that matched their actual financial resources. It would be a difficult adjustment, especially for family members who'd become accustomed to living beyond their means, but it was necessary to prevent future crises. My next call was to a gambling addiction counselor I'd found through my research the previous night. Dr. Patricia Williams specialized in intervention strategies for families dealing with severe gambling addiction, and her approach emphasized accountability and systemic change rather than simple behavior modification. What you're describing sounds like a classic case of gambling addiction that's progressed to the crisis stage, Dr. Williams said after I explained my family's situation. The good news is that crisis can be a powerful motivator for change if it's handled correctly. The bad news is that attempts to rescue gambling addicts without addressing underlying issues usually enable continued addictive behavior. Oh, that's exactly what I want to avoid, I said. I'm willing to help my family, but only if the help actually solves the problem instead of just postponing it. What would an effective intervention look like? Dr. Williams outlined a comprehensive approach that aligned with what I'd been thinking. Dad would need to enter residential treatment immediately before any debts were paid or financial assistance provided. The family would need to participate in education sessions about gambling addiction and enabling behaviors. Most importantly, Dad would need to surrender complete financial control as a condition of receiving help, demonstrating his commitment to recovery through concrete actions rather than just promises. The key is making sure that your assistance is contingent on compliance with treatment requirements, Dr. Williams explained. If he leaves treatment early or refuses to participate in ongoing recovery support, the financial help stops immediately. Recovery from gambling addiction requires sustained effort over years, not just weeks or months. I scheduled a family meeting for that afternoon at Dr. Williams's office, with the understanding that Dad's attendance was mandatory if he wanted my help with his debt crisis. I also arranged consultations with a debt consolidation attorney and a residential treatment facility that could accept patients immediately. The next challenge was contacting my family to explain my conditions without giving them room to negotiate or manipulate the situation. I called Emma's fiancé Mark again, since his number was still unblocked, and asked him to deliver a message to the family. Tell everyone that I'll be at Dr. Patricia Williams's office at 3 o'clock this afternoon, I said. That's a gambling addiction counselor downtown. If Dad wants help with his loan shark problem, he needs to be there along with Emma and Mom. Tyler can come too if his parents approve. But this isn't a discussion or negotiation. These are the terms for receiving my assistance." "What if Thomas refuses to go?" Mark asked. "From what Emma's told me, he's been pretty resistant to admitting he has a gambling problem." "Then he can figure out how to handle $67,000 in loan shark debt on his own," I said. "I'm not interested in helping someone who isn't committed to real change. If he's serious about protecting his family from the consequences of his addiction, he'll show up." Mark was quiet for a moment before responding. "Maria, I want you to know that Emma realizes how badly she screwed up by not telling you the truth about what was happening. She's been crying for 2 days straight, partly because she's scared about the loan sharks, but mostly because she knows she's lost your trust." The acknowledgement meant something, but it wasn't enough to repair the damage that had been done. "Emma can rebuild my trust by participating honestly in family therapy and taking responsibility for her own financial situation," I said. "I'm not looking for apologies. I'm looking for real change that prevents this kind of deception from happening again." After hanging up with Mark, I spent the morning making financial arrangements that would allow me to help my family without compromising my own long-term security. I transferred money from my savings account to cover the loan shark debt, but I didn't authorize payment yet. The money would only be released if Dad successfully entered treatment and the family agreed to ongoing therapy and financial restructuring. I also researched property management companies that could help the family sell their house quickly and find appropriate rental housing that matched their actual income. The financial reality was harsh but necessary. They couldn't afford to maintain their current lifestyle without my monthly contributions, and those contributions were ending permanently. As 3 o'clock approached, I drove to Dr. Williams's office, feeling nervous, but determined. I was about to implement the most expensive and emotionally difficult decision of my life, but it was also the most morally clear choice I'd ever made. I couldn't control whether Dad would choose recovery over his addiction, but I could ensure that innocent family members were protected while real solutions were pursued. The question that remained was whether my family would accept help that came with genuine accountability, or whether they would reject assistance that didn't allow them to maintain their destructive patterns. In a few hours, I would find out who my family really was when forced to choose between easy money and real change. Dr. Williams's office was located in a professional building downtown, with comfortable seating and neutral decor designed to create a calm environment for difficult conversations. I arrived 15 minutes early and spent the time reviewing the documents I'd prepared: treatment program information, financial management contracts, and a detailed timeline for how the family intervention would proceed if Dad agreed to my conditions. At exactly 3 o'clock, Emma arrived with Mom, both of them looking exhausted and frightened. Emma's eyes were red from crying, and Mom appeared to have aged several years since I'd last seen her at Thanksgiving. They sat across from me without making eye contact. Initially, the weight of their deception and the current crisis creating an almost tangible tension in the room. Dad arrived 10 minutes later, accompanied by Tyler's father, my Uncle Richard, who'd apparently driven him to ensure he actually attended. Dad looked terrible. His skin was grayish. His hands were shaking slightly, and he kept glancing around the room as if looking for escape routes. When Dr. Williams asked him to put his phone in a secure drawer to prevent interruptions, he hesitated for almost 30 seconds before complying. "Thank you all for coming," Dr. Williams began. "Maria has asked me to facilitate this conversation because your family is facing a crisis that requires immediate action and long-term commitment to change. Before we discuss solutions, I need everyone to acknowledge the reality of your situation without minimization or denial." She turned to Dad first. "Thomas, your gambling addiction has put your family in physical danger and destroyed trust with people who love you. You've accumulated debts that threaten innocent family members with violence, and you've done this while lying to everyone about the extent of your problem. Do you accept responsibility for creating this crisis?" Dad's response was immediate but defensive. "Look, I know I've made some mistakes with gambling, but calling it an addiction is probably an overstatement. I had some bad luck lately, made some poor choices, but I can handle this situation if I just get some breathing room financially. The loan shark thing got out of hand because of timing, not because I have some kind of serious gambling problem. The denial was so complete and delusional that it took my breath away. Even facing threats against his granddaughter's safety, even after being confronted with evidence of systematic deception, Dad was still trying to minimize his gambling as bad luck, rather than acknowledging the addiction that had destroyed his family's security. Dad, you've been gambling for 2 years, I said, my voice steady but filled with controlled anger. You've lost at least $67,000 to loan sharks, probably much more when you count casino losses. You've stolen nearly $40,000 from me through manipulation and lies. You've put Madison and Emma at risk of violence because you can't stop gambling long enough to think about anyone except yourself. I didn't steal anything from you, Dad shot back, his voice rising. You gave me that money willingly because you wanted to help your family. I used it to keep us afloat during a difficult time. If I made some mistakes along the way, that doesn't make me a thief or an addict. Dr. Williams intervened before the conversation could escalate further. Thomas, let's focus on what happens next, rather than relitigating past decisions. Maria is willing to help resolve the immediate crisis, but only if you accept treatment for gambling addiction and agree to ongoing accountability measures. Are you willing to consider those conditions? Dad looked around the room, probably calculating whether he could manipulate the situation to get access to my money without accepting the restrictions I'd outlined. What kind of treatment are we talking about? I'm not going to some locked facility where they treat me like a mental patient, and I'm not giving up control of my own finances to prove some point about responsibility. The treatment program is 60 days of residential rehabilitation, followed by 2 years of outpatient therapy. Dr. Williams explained, financial control would be transferred to a professional money management service that would handle all household expenses while ensuring you can't access funds for gambling. Your family members would attend education sessions about gambling addiction and enabling behaviors. Absolutely not, Dad said immediately. I'm not going to be locked up for 2 months like I'm some kind of criminal, and I'm sure as hell not giving my financial decisions to strangers who don't understand my situation. If Maria wants to help with the loan shark situation, that's great, but I'm not jumping through hoops like a trained dog to get help from my own daughter. The rejection was exactly what I'd expected, but still deeply disappointing. Even facing the loss of his home, the safety of his family, and his relationship with me, Dad, was choosing his addiction over recovery. He wanted to be rescued from consequences without accepting responsibility for the behaviors that had created those consequences. Then we're done here, I said, standing up to leave. I hope you figure out how to come up with $67,000 by January 3rd. Because that's the only way your family is going to be safe from the people you owe money to. Wait, Emma interjected, panic evident in her voice. Maria, please don't leave. Maybe we can work out some kind of compromise that Dad would be more comfortable with. I turned to look at Emma, seeing clearly for the first time how deeply she'd been affected by Dad's manipulation. She was still trying to manage his addiction by finding compromises that would give him access to money without requiring real change. The entire family had been trained to accommodate his gambling through years of enabling behavior. There is no compromise, I said firmly. Dad either commits to real recovery through residential treatment and ongoing accountability, or he faces the consequences of his gambling addiction without my money to cushion the fall. Those are the only 2 options. Mom spoke for the first time since arriving. Thomas, please just consider the treatment program. We can't handle this situation without Maria's help, and Madison's safety is more important than your pride. My pride, Dad exploded. This isn't about pride, it's about being treated with respect by my own family. I've worked construction for 30 years to support all of you, and now, because I had some bad luck at the casino, you want me to be locked up like a criminal and give up control of my own money. The self-pity and continued denial revealed the depth of Dad's addiction. He genuinely couldn't see that his gambling had put his granddaughter in danger, couldn't acknowledge that his bad luck was actually compulsive behavior that he couldn't control. The addiction was protecting itself by preventing him from accepting help that would threaten its existence. Dr. Williams tried one more approach. Thomas' gambling addiction is a recognized medical condition, not a moral failing. Treatment programs are designed to help people regain control of their lives, not to punish them. The restrictions Maria is proposing are temporary safeguards that would be lifted gradually as you demonstrate sustained recovery. But Dad was already standing up, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. I don't need to be cured of anything because I don't have a disease. I have a temporary financial problem that could be solved easily if my family wanted to help, instead of treating me like I'm broken. Since Maria apparently prefers to watch her family lose everything rather than help without conditions, I'll figure out another solution. He walked toward the door, then turned back to face us. Don't blame me when the loan sharks show up at Emma's house next week. Don't blame me when Madison gets scared because strangers are following her to school. You could prevent all of that by just helping your family instead of playing amateur psychologist, but apparently your pride is more important than your niece's safety. The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. Dad was actually trying to make me responsible for potential violence against Madison, as if my refusal to enable his addiction was the cause of the crisis rather than his gambling behavior. He was weaponizing my love for innocent family members to pressure me into funding his continued addiction. After Dad left, the room was silent for several minutes. Emma was crying quietly, Mom looked completely defeated, and Uncle Richard seemed stunned by the complete breakdown of the intervention attempt. Dr. Williams waited patiently for someone to speak, probably recognizing that the family needed time to process what had just happened. "He's not going to change, is he?" Emma finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even with Madison's safety at risk, even with all of us begging him to get help, he's still choosing gambling over his family." "Addiction is a powerful force," Dr. Williams said gently. "Many people have to face severe consequences before they're willing to accept treatment. Thomas may not be ready to recover right now, but that doesn't mean recovery is impossible for him in the future." But the immediate crisis remained unsolved. The loan shark still expected payment by January 3rd. Dad had rejected the only assistance available to him, and innocent family members were still in danger because of his choices. I'd been prepared for the possibility that he would refuse treatment, but actually watching him choose his addiction over his family's safety was more painful than I'd anticipated. The question now was whether I would help protect Emma and Madison, despite Dad's refusal to accept recovery, or whether I would maintain my boundaries and let the family face the full consequences of his choices. Either decision would have lasting implications for my relationship with family members who were both victims of Dad's deception and participants in enabling his addiction. The silence in Dr. Williams's office after Dad's dramatic exit felt heavy, with the weight of decisions that needed to be made quickly. Emma was still crying. Mom looked completely overwhelmed, and I found myself facing the hardest choice of my life: how to protect innocent people without enabling the addiction that had put them in danger. "Emma, Mom," I said, my voice calm but determined. "Dad made his choice when he walked out of here. Now I need to make mine. I'm going to pay the loan sharks directly to eliminate the threat against Madison and you, but this money isn't going to Dad, and it's not solving his gambling problem. It's buying time to implement real solutions that protect everyone except the person who created this crisis." Emma looked up from her tissues, hope and confusion mixing in her expression. "What kind of real solutions? If Dad won't get treatment, how do we prevent this from happening again?" I'd spent the morning preparing for exactly this scenario, anticipating that Dad might refuse help and leave his family to face consequences they didn't deserve. First, I'm calling the FBI to report the loan shark threats. These people are engaged in organized criminal activity, and federal law enforcement has resources that local police don't. Your family is going to become witnesses in a federal investigation, which means you'll have access to witness protection services if necessary. The plan I developed was complex and would require cooperation from multiple family members, but it addressed both the immediate safety crisis and the longer-term problem of Dad's addiction. Second, we're going to force Dad to face legal consequences for his financial crimes. Gambling away money intended for family expenses while lying about employment status probably constitutes fraud. If he won't accept treatment voluntarily, maybe facing criminal charges will motivate him to reconsider. Mom looked shocked. You want to have your own father arrested? I want to protect Madison from loan sharks and prevent Dad from putting the family in danger again, I said firmly. If that requires him to face criminal consequences for his choices, then yes, I'm willing to pursue that option. He's had multiple opportunities to accept help voluntarily, and he's chosen his addiction instead. Uncle Richard, who'd been silent since Dad's departure, finally spoke up. Maria, I understand you're angry, but involving federal law enforcement could destroy any possibility of family reconciliation. Once you report Thomas to the FBI, there's no taking that back. There's already no possibility of family reconciliation as long as Dad continues gambling, I replied. He's going to keep accumulating debts, lying about financial crises, and putting innocent people at risk until someone forces him to stop. I'd rather have him angry at me from a treatment facility than have Madison threatened by loan sharks because I was too afraid to take decisive action. Dr. Williams had been listening carefully to the conversation, and now she offered a professional perspective on the situation. Maria's approach is actually consistent with best practices for dealing with gambling addicts who refuse treatment. Sometimes legal consequences are necessary to break through the denial and manipulation that addiction creates. The goal isn't punishment. It's creating circumstances where recovery becomes the most attractive option available. I turned to Emma, who would be most affected by my decision to involve federal law enforcement. You and Madison need to pack essential belongings today and move to a safe location until the FBI can arrest the loan sharks. I'll pay for temporary housing, but you can't stay in your current home until this threat is eliminated. Where are we supposed to go? Emma asked, practical concerns mixing with her emotional distress. Madison has school, I have work commitments, and our whole life is built around staying in Sacramento. There's a witness protection safe house program for families facing organized crime threats, I explained. It's temporary, probably just a few weeks while the FBI builds their case, but it will keep you safe while I handle the financial side of this crisis. The next part of my plan was the most difficult to explain, because it required family members to accept a completely different lifestyle than what they'd become accustomed to. When the immediate danger is over, you're going to move to a different house, probably a rental apartment that you can afford on your actual income without help from me. The current house will need to be sold to pay off debts and establish a fresh financial foundation. Emma's face crumpled as she realized the full scope of what I was proposing. We're going to lose everything, aren't we? Our home, our neighborhood, Madison's school, everything that feels stable and familiar. You're going to lose the lifestyle that was built on Dad's gambling addiction and my unknowing financial contributions, I said gently but firmly, but you're going to gain something more important, freedom from the constant stress of covering up financial crises and protecting Dad's secrets. You'll be able to build a life based on what you can actually afford instead of what you can manipulate from other people. Mom had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke with a clarity I hadn't heard from her in years. Maria's right. I've been so focused on keeping the family together and protecting Thomas from consequences that I've lost sight of what's actually good for everyone, including him. If going through the legal system is what it takes to get him real help, then maybe that's what needs to happen. The admission represented a fundamental shift in family dynamics. Mom was acknowledging that enabling Dad's addiction hadn't protected him, it had made the problem worse while putting everyone else at risk. Her willingness to support legal intervention suggested she was finally ready to prioritize the family's safety over Dad's comfort. What about Thomas? Uncle Richard asked. If you report him to the FBI along with the loan sharks, he could face federal charges for the financial fraud. He could go to prison. Federal prosecutors are usually willing to negotiate reduced charges in exchange for cooperation and completion of court-mandated treatment programs. I explained. If Dad helps the FBI build a case against the loan sharks and agrees to enter gambling addiction rehabilitation, he'll probably face probation and restitution requirements rather than prison time. But that choice will be up to him. I'm not going to protect him from legal consequences anymore. The plan I was implementing would completely restructure my family's situation, forcing everyone to face reality without the cushioning effect of my financial contributions. It was harsh but necessary, designed to address the root causes of the crisis, rather than just treating symptoms. Over the next hour, I made a series of phone calls that set the intervention in motion. First, I contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit to report the loan shark threats and Dad's gambling-related fraud. The agent I spoke with was interested in the case because organized loan sharking was a priority target for federal law enforcement. Next, I arranged for Emma and Madison to be moved to a safe house that afternoon with expenses covered by victim assistance programs. The temporary housing wasn't luxurious, but it was secure and would keep them protected while the investigation proceeded. Finally, I authorized the payment to the loan sharks, but only after confirming with the FBI that the transaction would be monitored to help build evidence against the criminal organization. My money would eliminate the immediate threat to my family while also contributing to a federal case that might protect other families from similar violence. As we prepared to leave Dr. Williams's office, Emma grabbed my arm. "Maria, I need you to know how sorry I am about lying to you for so long. I thought I was protecting you from stress you didn't need, but I realize now that I was actually protecting Dad from facing consequences he deserved." The apology felt genuine, and for the first time since discovering the truth about my family's situation, I felt hopeful about the possibility of rebuilding relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation. "Emma, we can work through the trust issues over time if you're committed to being honest going forward. What matters right now is keeping Madison safe and making sure this never happens again." As I drove home from the intervention, I reflected on what I'd accomplished in a single afternoon. I'd protected innocent family members from immediate danger-initiated legal proceedings that would force Dad to face consequences for his addiction, and established boundaries that would prevent me from being exploited financially in the future. The cost had been enormous, nearly $70,000 when treatment expenses were added to the loan shark payment, but the investment was buying real solutions rather than temporary fixes. My family would emerge from this crisis smaller and poorer, but hopefully healthier and more honest than they'd been in years. Dad had chosen his addiction over his family's safety, but that choice didn't have to determine the fate of everyone he'd put at risk. Sometimes protecting the people you love means making decisions they can't or won't make for themselves, even when those decisions come at significant personal cost. 3 months after the intervention, I sat in a small coffee shop in Sacramento waiting for Emma to arrive for our weekly check-in meeting. These visits had become part of our family's new normal, a way for me to stay connected with my sister's recovery process while maintaining the boundaries that protected me from future manipulation. The changes in my family's situation had been dramatic and sometimes painful, but they'd also created space for authentic relationships to develop. Emma walked through the cafe door looking different than I'd ever seen her as an adult. She was wearing scrubs from her new job as a medical assistant. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence I'd never noticed when she was dependent on family money for her lifestyle. The transformation went deeper than just appearance. She seemed more grounded, more present, less constantly worried about maintaining facades. "Sorry, I'm a few minutes late," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "My shift at the clinic ran over because we had a patient emergency. It's amazing how much I'm learning about medical procedures just from being around healthcare professionals all day." Emma's job at the community health clinic was part of the comprehensive life restructuring that had followed Dad's arrest and entry into court-mandated treatment. After the FBI investigation had dismantled the loan shark operation, our family had faced the reality of building sustainable lives based on actual income rather than gambling winnings and financial manipulation. "How's Madison adjusting to the new school?" I asked. The transition had been one of my biggest concerns since moving from their suburban home to a modest two-bedroom apartment had required changing school districts. Better than I expected, honestly," Emma replied, stirring sugar into her coffee. She was upset about leaving her friends at first, but the new school has smaller class sizes and more individual attention from teachers. Her grades have actually improved, and she's made friends with kids who aren't focused on expensive clothes and gadgets. The move to more modest circumstances had initially felt like a punishment to Madison, but it had also freed her from the social pressures that came with trying to maintain an artificially elevated lifestyle. Without access to credit cards for shopping trips and expensive entertainment, she'd discovered interests in reading, hiking, and volunteer work that didn't require significant financial resources. "And you, how are you feeling about the changes?" I asked, genuinely curious about Emma's perspective on the dramatic shift in her circumstances. "It's weird to say this, but I'm happier than I've been in years," Emma said, her voice filled with surprise at her own admission. I didn't realize how much stress I was carrying from constantly worrying about Dad's gambling covering up financial problems and managing all the lies we were telling to keep the family looking normal. Emma's therapy sessions had helped her understand how exhausting it had been to enable Dad's addiction while maintaining the facade of family stability. The energy she'd previously devoted to crisis management and deception was now available for building genuine relationships and pursuing personal goals. "The job is hard work, but it's honest work," she continued. "I'm earning my own money for the first time since college, and there's something really satisfying about that independence. Plus, working in healthcare has given me perspective on real problems versus the manufactured crises Dad was always creating." The contrast between Emma's current stability and the chaos of 6 months earlier was remarkable. She'd gone from being financially dependent on family manipulation to supporting herself and Madison through her own efforts. The apartment they shared was small but comfortable, furnished with items they'd chosen based on need and budget rather than appearance and status. "Have you heard from Dad recently?" I asked, a question that had become routine during our weekly conversations. "He called last weekend from the treatment facility," Emma said, her expression becoming more serious. "He's finally starting to acknowledge that gambling was actually controlling his life, rather than just being a hobby that got out of hand. The counselors there don't let him minimize or rationalize his behavior the way we used to." Dad's court-mandated treatment program was an intensive 6-month residential facility that specialized in gambling addiction recovery. The program required complete isolation from gambling environments, surrender of all financial control, and participation in group therapy sessions where denial and manipulation were directly challenged by other addicts in recovery. "Does he seem like he's making real progress, or is he just saying what he thinks people want to hear?" I asked. Dad's history of deception made it difficult to trust any reports of change, even when filtered through professional treatment providers. "The counselors say he's going through the typical stages of recovery," Emma explained. "He was angry and defensive for the first month, spent the second month trying to negotiate special exceptions to program rules, and he's just now starting to actually engage with the therapy process. They warned us that real change would take time and that we shouldn't expect dramatic personality shifts immediately. The treatment facility had educated the entire family about gambling addiction as a chronic condition that required ongoing management, rather than a problem that could be solved quickly. Dad would always be vulnerable to relapse, particularly during times of stress or when he had access to money without accountability measures. "What about Mom? How is she adjusting to everything?" I asked. "She's doing really well, actually," Emma said, smiling for the first time during our conversation. "She got a part-time job at a bookstore downtown, which she absolutely loves, and she's been attending the family support group meetings every week without fail. I think she's finally starting to understand how much she enabled Dad's gambling without realizing it." Mom's participation in Al-Anon meetings for families affected by addiction had been eye-opening for her. She'd learned that her efforts to protect Dad from consequences had actually made his gambling worse by removing natural barriers to destructive behavior. The guilt she initially felt about failing to prevent his addiction had gradually transformed into understanding that she couldn't control his choices. She's also started setting boundaries with Dad that she never had before, Emma continued. When he calls from treatment, she listens to his progress reports but doesn't engage with attempts to minimize his behavior or rush his recovery timeline. The counselors taught her how to be supportive without being enabling. The reconstruction of family relationships around honesty and accountability had been challenging, but ultimately liberating for everyone except Dad, who was slowly learning to function without the manipulation tactics he'd relied on for years. Family members were developing authentic connections based on shared interests and genuine care rather than financial dependency and crisis management. And Tyler, how is he handling everything? Tyler had been particularly affected by the family crisis because he'd been kept in the dark about Dad's addiction while still experiencing the stress and instability it created. "Tyler's thriving," Emma said, her voice filled with pride for her younger cousin. "He's gotten really involved in school activities now that he doesn't have to worry about family drama all the time. He started a peer counseling program to help other students deal with family addiction issues. He says going through this experience made him want to help other kids who are dealing with similar situations." Tyler's resilience had been remarkable throughout the family crisis. His honesty during the intervention process had provided crucial information, and his perspective as the youngest family member had helped adults understand how addiction affects children, even when they're supposedly protected from its direct effects. "What about Dad's legal situation? Have you heard anything about plea negotiations?" I asked. "The prosecutor is offering a deal where he pleads guilty to fraud charges but serves probation instead of prison time if he completes the full treatment program and pays restitution," Emma explained. "The restitution includes paying you back for the money he obtained through deception plus covering the costs of the loan shark payment." The legal consequences had provided structure and accountability that family interventions alone couldn't achieve. Dad's compliance with treatment requirements wasn't optional anymore. It was a condition of avoiding federal prison. The external pressure had broken through denial mechanisms that had resisted family pleading and emotional appeals. "He'll be on probation for 5 years with regular check-ins and mandatory attendance at gambling addiction support groups," Emma continued. "Any access to credit or significant amounts of cash has to be approved by a probation officer. It's basically enforced financial accountability that will continue long after treatment ends." The comprehensive approach addressed the reality that gambling addiction recovery required long-term support systems rather than short-term interventions. Dad would have professional oversight of his finances and regular monitoring of his recovery progress for years, creating barriers that would make relapse much more difficult. As our conversation wound down, Emma asked the question that had become central to all our family interactions since the crisis. "Maria, do you think you'll ever be able to completely forgive Dad for what he put us through?" I considered the question carefully, recognizing its complexity and importance. I think forgiveness will be possible if he demonstrates real change over time, I said finally. But trust is something he'll have to earn back through consistent actions, not just apologies. Right now, I'm focused on protecting myself while staying open to the possibility of rebuilding our relationship if he proves he's committed to recovery. The answer felt honest and hopeful without being naive. Dad's gambling addiction had caused enormous damage to family relationships, but addiction was also a medical condition that could be treated successfully with proper intervention and ongoing support. Recovery was possible, but it would require sustained effort from Dad and continued vigilance from family members who'd learned to recognize and interrupt enabling behaviors. As I drove home from our coffee meeting, I reflected on how different my life had become since implementing boundaries that protected my financial and emotional well-being. I was still connected to my family, but the connections were healthier and more authentic than they'd ever been during the years of manipulation and deception. The cost of intervening in my family's crisis had been enormous, nearly $80,000, when all expenses were calculated, but the investment had purchased something invaluable, the possibility of genuine relationships based on honesty rather than exploitation. My family was smaller, poorer, and more scattered than before, but we were also more real than we'd been in years. 1 year later, I stood in the kitchen of my new Portland home, a modest 2-bedroom house I'd been able to purchase after Dad began making regular restitution payments. The morning sun streamed through windows that I'd chosen myself, illuminating a space that belonged entirely to me, free from the financial strain that had characterized my life during the years of unknowingly funding Dad's gambling addiction. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Dad graduates from the extended treatment program next week. He's asked if you'd consider being part of the family meeting with his counselors. No pressure, just wanted you to know you're invited. The message represented how much our communication had changed, direct, honest, and respectful of boundaries I'd established to protect my own well-being. Dad's recovery had been neither quick nor simple. After completing the initial 6-month residential program, he'd experienced a relapse during his first week of supervised community living. The setback had led to additional treatment and extended supervision, but it had also forced him to confront the reality that recovery was an ongoing process, rather than a destination he could reach and then ignore. More importantly, the relapse had tested the family's commitment to maintaining boundaries, instead of enabling his addiction. Instead of rushing to rescue him from consequences, we'd allowed the legal system and treatment professionals to handle the crisis while offering emotional support that didn't interfere with accountability measures. The approach had been painful, but ultimately successful. Dad had returned to treatment with genuine motivation instead of just compliance with external requirements. I walked to my living room and sat in the comfortable chair I'd finally been able to afford after stopping the monthly transfers that had drained my savings account for years. The space was furnished with items I'd chosen based on my own preferences and budget, creating an environment that reflected who I was, rather than who I thought I needed to be to maintain family relationships. The previous weekend, I'd hosted Tyler for a visit to Portland, giving him a chance to see the city and spend time together without the chaos that had characterized family gatherings during the height of Dad's gambling crisis. We'd gone hiking in the Columbia River Gorge, visited Powell's books, and had long conversations about his plans for college and career. The relationship we'd built was honest and supportive, free from the undercurrents of financial manipulation that had tainted other family connections. "You seem different than you did a year ago," Tyler had observed as we walked along the riverfront. "More relaxed, I guess, like you're not constantly worried about something." His observation was accurate. The chronic stress of managing family financial crises while struggling with my own budget had lifted when I'd established boundaries that protected my resources and emotional energy. I was sleeping better, eating more regularly, and pursuing friendships and hobbies that had been neglected during the years of crisis management and emotional manipulation. Emma's transformation had been equally remarkable. Her job at the community health clinic had evolved into a career pathway. She was taking evening classes to become a certified medical assistant and had discovered a genuine passion for healthcare. Madison was excelling in her new school environment and had developed interests in environmental science and community service. Both of them had found stability and purpose that didn't depend on external financial support or maintaining facades of prosperity. Mom had surprised everyone with her resilience during the family reconstruction. Her part-time job at the bookstore had become full-time employment, and she'd discovered organizational and customer service skills she'd never developed during her years as a stay-at-home wife and enabler. More importantly, she'd learned to recognize and interrupt the patterns of behavior that had allowed Dad's addiction to escalate unchecked. The loan sharks who had threatened my family were serving federal prison sentences their criminal organization dismantled through the investigation that had grown from my initial FBI report. Other families had been freed from similar cycles of intimidation and violence, creating positive outcomes that extended beyond my own family's crisis. But the most significant change was in my understanding of what family loyalty actually meant. I'd spent years believing that love required unconditional financial support and acceptance of harmful behavior. The crisis had taught me that real love sometimes meant setting boundaries that protected everyone involved, even when those boundaries caused temporary pain or conflict. True family loyalty meant refusing to enable destructive behavior even when that refusal led to difficult consequences. It meant prioritizing long-term well-being over short-term comfort, honesty over harmony, and authentic relationships over financial dependency. Most importantly, it meant recognizing that helping someone sometimes required allowing them to face the natural results of their choices. Dad's recovery had required him to accept responsibility for the damage his addiction had caused, make amends through concrete actions rather than just apologies, and rebuild trust through consistent behavior over time. The process had been slow and sometimes frustrating, but it had created the possibility of genuine reconciliation based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. I picked up my phone and typed a response to Emma's invitation. "I'll think about attending Dad's graduation meeting. Let me know the details and I'll decide based on my schedule and comfort level." The response reflected the new dynamic in our family. My participation was voluntary and conditional rather than assumed and manipulated. As I prepared for work that morning, I reflected on the life lesson that had emerged from our family crisis. Love doesn't require sacrificing your own well-being to enable someone else's destructive behavior. Genuine family bonds are built on honesty, mutual respect, and shared responsibility, rather than financial dependency and emotional manipulation. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to rescue someone from consequences that might motivate real change. Sometimes protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary for maintaining the strength and resources needed to help others effectively when they're ready to accept genuine assistance. The money I'd lost to Dad's gambling addiction could never be completely recovered, but the wisdom I'd gained about relationships, boundaries, and self-protection was invaluable. I'd learned to distinguish between helping and enabling, between family loyalty and emotional manipulation, between temporary discomfort and long-term harm. My family emerged from our crisis smaller and less prosperous than before, but healthier and more authentic in ways that prosperity alone could never provide. We'd learned that real security comes from honest relationships and sustainable choices, rather than manipulation and external financial support. The experience had taught me that you can't save someone who isn't ready to be saved, but you can always protect your ability to help when they are ready for genuine change. You can love someone while refusing to fund their self-destruction. You can maintain hope for healing while accepting responsibility for your own well-being. Most importantly, I'd learned that setting boundaries isn't about punishment or abandonment. It's about creating space for authentic relationships to develop while protecting everyone involved from the cycle of crisis and enabling that keeps families trapped in destructive patterns. Today, I have a family based on choice rather than obligation, honesty rather than manipulation, and mutual support rather than one sided financial dependency. It took a devastating crisis to teach us how to love each other properly, but the relationships we've built are stronger and more sustainable than anything we had when prosperity masked the dysfunction underneath. The greatest gift I gave my family wasn't the money I spent resolving their crisis. It was the boundaries I established that forced all of us to face reality and build something authentic from the rubble of our previous deceptions. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to choose between helping someone you love and protecting yourself from being taken advantage of? How did you handle the balance between family loyalty and personal boundaries? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Thank you for taking this journey with me, for listening to my story, and for understanding that sometimes love requires difficult choices. If this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more content about family relationships and personal growth, and share it with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the power of healthy boundaries. Remember that you deserve relationships built on honesty and mutual respect, and it's never too late to start protecting your own well-being while staying open to genuine connection. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say, no, set boundaries, and trust that real change is possible when people are motivated by authentic consequences rather than rescued from them. May you find the courage to love others without losing yourself in the process, and may your family relationships be built on the solid foundation of truth rather than the shifting sand of manipulation and enabling. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.